He followed every rule. He had legal status, a family, a home. But one day, he vanished. Deported without warning. Not because of who he was, but because of a system too broken to see the truth. And the person who tried to fix it? Silenced. This is not just a legal error. This is a story about truth, power, and the cost of doing what's right. Kilmar Abrego Garcia never thought one day he'd vanish from his home in Maryland, leaving behind his wife and 5-year-old child, without a warning, without a proper goodbye. He was no stranger to paperwork. His legal status had been protected. He had done everything by the book. And yet, in the early hours of March 15, under the cover of rushed decisions and political urgency, he was gone. What followed wasn't just a mistake. It was the kind of error that turns lives upside down. Garcia was deported, sent to El Salvador, even though he was never supposed to be removed from the country. It wasn't his country of origin. It wasn't where he belonged. The order had come down fast, part of a broad immigration push that invoked a centuries-old law, one created during wartime, used now to justify mass deportations. And in this storm of bureaucracy, one man's life got swept away. Back in Maryland, silence settled. His wife, terrified. His child, confused. No one knew where he was or why it had happened. But the truth began to unravel, not from protests or investigations, but from inside the courtroom, and from someone unexpected, Erez Reuveni, a seasoned attorney at the Department of Justice, with 15 years of experience. During a hearing in front of Judge Paula Xinis, he did something rare in government litigation. He told the truth. Mr. Abrego Garcia should not have been removed, he admitted openly. 5 words that cracked open a whole system. And that one sentence. It cost him everything. In a quiet courtroom, with only a few people present, Erez Reuveni's words echoed louder than any shout. Mr. Abrego Garcia should not have been removed. It was not a slip. It was a moment of conscience. A government attorney had admitted a wrong, on record, before a federal judge. Judge Paula Xinis looked directly at him. Her tone was calm, but firm. She called the removal of Mr. Garcia an illegal act. She didn't say it lightly. And she wasn't wrong. The courtroom sat in stillness. The kind of stillness that comes just before a storm. Outside those walls, that one honest sentence triggered a reaction at the highest levels of the Justice Department. Less than 24 hours after the hearing, Reuveni received a call, not to thank him, not to clarify, but to suspend him. Indefinitely. A man with 15 years of experience. Gone from his role. Just like that. His email access was cut. His office badge disabled. No goodbye, no explanation to his team. Just a message from Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche: Reuveni had engaged in conduct prejudicial to your client, the United States government. He didn't lie. He didn't twist facts. He told the court what was true, and for that, he paid the price. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, made a public statement the next day. Her words were sharp. At my direction, every Department of Justice attorney is required to zealously advocate on behalf of the United States. Any attorney who fails to abide by this direction will face consequences. It wasn't about truth. It was about loyalty. But to whom do government lawyers owe their loyalty? The government, or the truth? Inside the courtroom, Judge Xinis wasn't done. She ordered the Department of Justice to bring Garcia back, and gave them just over 3 days to do it. To fix what they had broken. But behind the scenes, not everyone was willing to admit fault. In fact, they were preparing to fight back. Judge Paula Xinis had seen enough. The facts weren't hidden. The government had admitted the mistake. And yet, days had passed and Mr. Abrego Garcia was still in El Salvador, held in a prison, alone, far from his family, and far from justice. So she acted. In a rare and powerful move, Judge Xinis granted a preliminary injunction. She gave the Department of Justice 3 days, not a minute more, to bring Mr. Garcia back to the United States. The court wasn't asking any more. It was ordering. The message was loud and clear: mistakes happen, but when they do, the government has a responsibility to make it right. But the DOJ wasn't ready to accept that. The very next day, they rushed to higher courts, filing an emergency motion to stop the judge's order. They argued that bringing Mr. Garcia back would be impossible. That it would cause harm to the government. That the order was, in their words, indefensible. But Judge Xinis wasn't moved by excuses. On Sunday, she responded with a 22-page opinion, detailed and direct. She dismantled the government's arguments, one by one. She pointed out something chilling: the DOJ had repeatedly claimed, without proof, that Mr. Garcia was connected to gang activity, a serious accusation, but one that was never backed by evidence. To the judge, this wasn't just a legal disagreement. It was about fairness, truth, and responsibility. She wrote, "This is not about the government's inability to return Mr. Garcia, but their lack of desire." A line that hit like thunder. She made it clear, the United States had not only made an administrative mistake. It had resisted correcting it, even when the truth was undeniable. So she made her ruling final: Mr. Garcia must be brought back. But even then, nothing was certain. In El Salvador, no one knew what condition he was in. His legal status in limbo. His family in Maryland still waiting, still hoping. And somewhere in Washington, a suspended lawyer sat in silence, punished not for breaking the law, but for speaking it. Inside the walls of the Department of Justice, silence can be loud. Especially when it hides a storm. After the courtroom shock, whispers turned into closed-door meetings. Questions were raised not about how such a serious error had occurred, but about why Erez Reuveni had admitted it. To some in the DOJ, he had crossed a line. Not by lying, but by breaking the code of silence. His suspension wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. A warning to others: if you speak the truth that embarrasses the system will turn on you. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche didn't hold back. The official reason? Reuveni had acted prejudicial to his client, the United States government. But privately, insiders said the real crime was disloyalty. He told the court something that wasn't supposed to be said. Some colleagues defended him quietly. They knew he had followed his conscience. Others avoided him completely, afraid to be seen standing too close to a man now considered radioactive. Overnight, the office had become a battlefield not of guns or fire, but of principle. At the center of it all, Reuveni remained silent. No public statement. No interview. But everyone knew the truth: he'd been removed for telling it. Meanwhile, higher UPS scrambled to contain the fallout. Press releases were carefully worded. The Attorney General emphasized loyalty and obedience. Public attention was brushed aside, painted as media noise. But something had cracked. Inside the DOJ, the question no one wanted to say out loud was now impossible to ignore. If the law is about truth, what happens when truth becomes the enemy? And while Washington played politics, Judge Xinis refused to back down. Her order stood. Her voice stayed firm. But time was ticking and Mr. Garcia was still not home. Behind every file, every signature, and every legal motion, one simple fact remained. An innocent man had been taken. And the very system meant to protect him was now the one holding him back. The courtroom had spoken. Judge Xinis had ordered the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. But in Washington, the response was not action, it was resistance. On Saturday, less than 24 hours after her ruling, the Department of Justice filed an emergency motion. They called the judge's order unworkable and impossible to carry out. They insisted that Garcia's return would cause harm to the government and demanded a pause on the injunction. But the timing said it all. Instead of rushing to bring a wrongfully deported man home, the DOJ rushed to court to stop the process. Not a single mention of his child waiting in Maryland. Not a word about the family torn apart. Just bureaucratic language and legal resistance. They pointed to logistics. They argued about foreign detention. They blamed administrative limitations. But at its core, it wasn't about can't. It was about won't. Judge Xinis saw through it. In her written response, she didn't soften the blow. She called the government's reasoning hollow. The emergency motion? Rejected. Again. She held her ground firm, composed, and unimpressed by the pressure from above. And she noticed something else, something deeply troubling. Throughout the filings, the government had dropped hints, over and over, that Garcia might have been tied to gang activity. Specifically, MS-13. But when the judge asked for proof, they had none. No documents. No charges. No prior investigations. Just a label, thrown in like a shadow, meant to scare. It was a tactic not uncommon, but unmistakable. In high-stakes immigration cases, painting someone as dangerous can shift the tone. It can justify mistakes. It can silence empathy. But not this time. Judge Xinis called it out. She warned the government that assumptions without evidence could not stand in her court. Still, the DOJ wasn't done. Behind the scenes, top officials debated their next move. Some pushed to appeal again. Others urged silence, hoping the headlines would fade. And somewhere in El Salvador, Garcia sat in a place he never should have seen, waiting, caught between nations, caught between decisions. The system was now doing what systems often do, defend itself first, and fix later. But the question still stood, quiet but sharp. If the government makes a mistake, who holds it accountable? The clock was ticking. Judge Xinis had given the Department of Justice just over 3 days to bring Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the United States. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A legal order, signed and sealed. But the hours passed, and still, no movement. Inside the DOJ, tension was rising. The media had caught on. Headlines were spinning. Questions were being asked. But officials stayed tight-lipped. There were calls to embassies, meetings behind closed doors, and paperwork moving at a speed far slower than justice demanded. Garcia, meanwhile, remained in custody in El Salvador. Not a criminal. Not a threat. Just a man misplaced by the machinery of power. His wife in Maryland called lawyers every day. His child asked when Dad was coming home. There were no answers. Only silence. And Judge Xinis. She waited, but not quietly. Her tone in court grew firmer. Her words sharper. She reminded the DOJ that the law was not optional. That this wasn't about politics or public image. It was about a man who never should have been taken, and a family that never should have been broken. Still, the government hesitated. They filed motion after motion. Delay after delay. They insisted the order was too hard. Too fast. Too complicated. But that wasn't what made it hard. What made it hard was admitting they were wrong. Time ran out. The deadline came and went. And Garcia was still not back. In her final words that week, Judge Xinis didn't yell. She didn't make threats. But she left no room for confusion. This court will not back away. The narrowest relief I can grant is also the only one that fits the truth. Bring him back. It was a ruling shaped not just by law, but by principle. A rare moment in the justice system where a single voice cut through all the noise. But rulings don't fly planes. Would the government follow through? Would Garcia see his family again? Would a system that took him away have the courage to make it right? The next move would define everything. Kilmar Abrego Garcia eventually returned to the United States. No cameras. No public apology. Just a quiet flight, a silent ride, and a long embrace from a wife who had waited too long, and a child who didn't understand why his father had ever disappeared. The system had followed the order. But it hadn't admitted the truth. There was no press conference from the DOJ. No officials stepping forward to take responsibility. The same people who had moved so quickly to remove Garcia, now chose to stay silent when asked about his return. And what about Erez Reuveni? The man who had spoken the truth, who said plainly in court that Garcia should not have been removed, was still suspended. His name quietly erased from the DOJ's public statements. His future uncertain. His career possibly over. He didn't break the law. He didn't mislead the court. He simply chose to tell the truth. And for that, he paid a price. Judge Paula Xinis continued to serve. Her opinion remained published, her voice firm in the legal record. But even she knew this wasn't a victory. It was a correction. A fix that never should have been needed. The question left hanging in the air wasn't just about Garcia. It was about us. When the system makes a mistake, who speaks up? And when someone does, what happens to them? This case won't make it into many textbooks. It won't be turned into a movie. But for the Garcia family, it was everything. It was their life. Their freedom. Their truth. And for all of us watching from the outside, it was a quiet reminder. Sometimes justice comes not with a bang, but a whisper. Not with glory, but with courage. Not from the powerful, but from one person brave enough to say, "This is wrong." If this story moved you, if you believe truth still matters in a world full of noise, then hit that like button and subscribe for more real cases where justice isn't black and white. Each story we tell is a voice that refuses to be ignored. Join us. Let's keep these voices alive. This was your law story for today. See you in the next one.